Thank you, Reagan. I want to start. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms who are here, those who are watching online. Before you leave today, we do have a special gift for you. And at the end of the service, we're going to be recognizing some special categories of moms who are part of our church family. We also, in honor of Teacher Appreciation Week, have something for everybody who works in a school system. So if you're a teacher, bus driver, teacher's aide, administrator, whatever you are, we have something special for you today. So if you happen to be both a mom and somebody who works in the school system, you're going to be glad you came today. But the catch is, you do have to stay for the sermon. So if you have your Bible, I want you to open up to Matthew 14. Matthew 14. And while you're turning there, I want to introduce you to a guy that you probably have never heard of. Here's his picture. As I said, you probably don't recognize him. His name is George Muller. And when it comes to prayer, he was a rock star. For 50 years, he was the director of an orphanage, a complex of orphanages outside Bristol, England. And during his lifetime, he and his wife, Mary, personally cared for over 10,000 orphans and helped establish 117 schools, which offered a tuition-free education to over 100,000 children. But what made George Muller so unique, especially in the world of education and orphanages, is that he never asked for money. He never hired an advancement director. He never held a fundraiser. He never even sent out a letter asking people for money. He believed that since God had called him to start this orphanage, that God would figure out how to fund it. And so every morning when he got up, here's what he did. He made a list of everything he thought they would need to make it through that particular day, and he would pray just for those things. On one occasion, there's a famous story. He and a group of orphans are sitting around an empty table praying for breakfast because the cupboards were empty, when all of a sudden there was a knock on the door and an unexpected visitor came, a baker, with enough bread to feed everybody in the orphanage. A few minutes later, there was another knock on the door, and it was a milkman whose cart had broken down in front of the orphanage and who had to do something with the milk, so he donated it to the orphanage for that day. In his autobiography, George Muller says he can document over 1,000 prayers that were answered in oddly specific ways. There's another famous story that comes from a trip he made to Canada in August of 1877. The ship he was traveling on was almost all the way across the Atlantic when they ran into some thick fog, and the captain of the ship announced he was going to have to slow down, which would cause George Muller to miss his appointment in Quebec. At that point, George Muller commandeered the ship's map room and turned it into a prayer room, praying that the fog would lift. The captain was so impressed by that he too entered the room and was going to pray with George Muller when he got about halfway down to the floor to get on his knees, and George Muller stopped him and said, "Captain, there is no need for you to pray because the prayer has already been answered. Get up, Captain, for you will find that the fog has gone." And sure enough, they walked out on the bridge of the ship and the fog had lifted, and George Muller was able to keep his appointment. Let me stop there and just ask you, what comes to your mind whenever you hear stories like that? Maybe you're naturally skeptical and you think, I'm not really sure that makes a lot of sense. Maybe that's not the way it really happened. Maybe you're a bit envious because as you think back over your life, you can't think of even one prayer that you offered that was answered in that kind of clearly specific way. Or maybe you're angry because there's something that you've been praying about for a really long time, and every time you think you've got an answer, you look out the window and the fog is still there. The questions are still unanswered, the problems are still unsolved, and the direction is still unclear. So for the last few weeks, we've been talking about prayer in this series that we're calling Level Up. We've been talking about what to do when you find yourself in the space between the prayer and the answer. Another way to think about it would be, what can you do when you keep praying for the fog to lift, and every time you look out the window, it's still there? Now, if you've been there like I have, then you know that can be a really frustrating place to be. But the good news is there are some things you can do while you're waiting. So we talked about some of first, you have to make sure that your purposes and what you're praying about are aligned with God's purposes. Then John Hampton talked about you need to make sure that you're praying for God's glory and not your own glory. And then last week, John Hanlos talked about what it means to yield the how, or to give up your right to tell God what he should do and instead trust that whatever he does will be the right thing to do. Today, I want to take it a step further and talk about what can you do when the time comes for you to do something while you're waiting for God to do something. We'll start by giving you the big idea, the key principle first, and then we'll unpack it together. But here it is. When you don't know what to do the next right thing. When you don't know what to do the next right thing. Now, if you've seen the movie Frozen 2, I want you to raise your hand. If you've seen it more than once, I want you to come forward when the service is over. In the movie, there is a song near the end that was written specifically for the movie, and it comes at the darkest moment in the film when one of the characters, Anna, is faced with uncertainty about what to do next because she's lost her sister Elsa and Olaf, this magical snowman that was created by Elsa. And don't worry about the plot line, but I want you to listen to the lyrics of the song. Here's the way it says. Here's the way it starts. It says, "You've gone to a place I cannot find. This grief has a gravity. It pulls me down. But a tiny voice whispers in my mind, you are lost, hope is gone, but you must go on and do the next right thing." Now, to be clear, I don't usually recommend getting your beliefs from Disney movies, but that's actually not bad. And you might want to latch on to that because some of you know what it's like to find yourself in a place where it feels like your grief has a gravity. And the uncertainty is pulling you down, and it feels as if all hope is lost, and you don't know what to do next. And they say, in that moment when you're not sure what to do, just do the next right thing. The question is, how do you identify that next right thing? So to help us answer that, we're going to look at a famous story from Matthew 14 in which a group of Jesus' closest friends find themselves in an impossible situation. The fog is thick, the wind is swirling, the waves are crashing, and the future is uncertain. And to make it even worse, they were doing exactly what Jesus told them to do. Jesus gave them a clear direction. They did it, and in the midst of that, it feels to them as if God has somehow abandoned them. Now, so just to set the scene for you, the story we're going to look at happens right on the heels of a famous story that you've heard about all your life. Jesus takes these 5 loaves of bread and these 2 small fish, and he multiplies them, and he feeds this huge crowd of 5,000 men. If you add in the women and children, probably 10 or 15,000 people. It's like the biggest field party in history. And then what happens is, after he does that miracle, it takes a while for everybody to wind down and calm down. So the way the gospel writers tell us, the party ended about 9 o'clock. It's at that point that Jesus sends the crowd back home, and he turns to his disciples. He says, hey, I want you to get in this boat, and I want you to cross over to the other side of the lake. And so that's what they do. They get in the boat, they head off back to the other side of the lake, and as they're going, they find themselves caught in this vicious storm. And while they're out there fighting for their lives, Jesus is up on this mountainside, and he's praying by himself. Look at the way Matthew remembered this part of the story. Matthew 14, verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Now, make sure you catch this. One of those eyewitness details that the gospel writers love to include that adds credibility to the story. So I've got another picture I want to show you of a boat that would be something similar. So the place where all this took place was the Sea of Galilee, and in normal conditions, it would take somebody about 2 hours to cross the sea. And because most of the disciples were professional fishermen, and that knew how to maneuver boats, they probably could have made it quicker. But in this instance, even though they're doing exactly what Jesus told them to do, what should have been a 2-hour kind of easy trip turned into an all-night struggle. And some of you know what that's like. Some of you know what it's like to do exactly what you think Jesus wants you to do, only to discover that it's harder than you thought it would be. Some of you applied for a job that you were certain Jesus wanted you to have, and you still haven't heard back. Some of you took the treatment that you were sure was going to solve your problem, and for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be working. Or maybe you decided to follow Jesus, thinking that would solve all your problems, but every Sunday when you go home from church, there are your problems there to greet you. Some of you know what it's like to live your life with the wind working against you. And so you can identify with the disciples in the story. They did exactly what Jesus told them to do, and yet their journey took a lot longer and was much harder than they could have ever anticipated. But then you get to verse 25, and the craziest, most unexpected, most unpredictable thing that could possibly happen happens. Sometime between the hours of 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., they look up and they see Jesus walking towards them on the surface of the water. Check this out in verse 25. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Now, if you got questions about that, you're in good company. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Now, again, if you got questions about that, you're in good company. The disciples didn't understand this either. They'd never seen anybody walk on water. They didn't have any idea how to process this. But it's in the process of them trying to make sense of what they're seeing that one of them, a guy named Peter, speaks up. He initiates this conversation with Jesus. And you have to keep in mind the context. Peter has been out there all night. He's been fighting for his life. He's been trying to get to the place where he knows Jesus wants him to go, but he's confused, he's exhausted, he's frustrated, and he wants to know what in the world is going on. And so he makes this request of Jesus in verse 28. Check this out. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. So you look at this exchange. Here's Peter trying to figure out what he's supposed to do next. He wants to know, I did what you asked me to do. It hasn't worked out. What's the next step in this story? He's trying to identify the next right thing. And so there's some things we can learn this. If you want to track with us, here's the first thing. Most of the time, while we look for explanations, God issues commands. Most of the time we look for explanations and God comes up and says, "Here's what I want you to do." Now keep in mind that before this conversation, Peter had already experienced a whole litany of incredible things with Jesus. He'd seen him cast out demons. He'd seen him give sight to the blind and hearing to deaf people. He'd even seen him raise the dead. If you go back to Matthew chapter 8, there's this cool scene where Jesus goes to Peter's house, and it says that Peter's mother-in-law, who apparently lived with them, was nearing death because of a fever. Like she's on her deathbed, and Jesus goes in and he heals her. And you got to understand, depending on Peter's relationship with his mother-in-law, that may have brought about some mixed emotions, but she survives, and Peter knows this guy can do anything. This guy can do anything. So he says, "Lord, if it's you, I want you to tell me to come to you." At some point during the night, Peter reached a point where he knew that the status quo was no longer acceptable. No matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't go back to the beginning, and he was caught in a situation where it didn't feel like he could move forward no matter how hard he rowed, no matter how hard he tried to make progress. And so at a point of near desperation, he looks up to Jesus and he says, "If it's you, now would be a really good time for you to tell me to do something." Some of you have prayed prayers like that. Some of you have prayed prayers where you said, Lord, if you're ever going to do something, now would be a good time. And look at how Jesus responded. Rather than giving Peter a lengthy explanation, and rather explaining what the next 3 moves are going to look like and how all this is going to fit together, he instead says, Peter, I want you to come. No explanation, but a clear command. I don't know about you, but like, I like explanations, right? When I sign up for something, I want somebody to explain to me the strategy behind it and all the possible variables. And here's what will happen if you do this. And then if you do that, here's what's likely to happen. But I've learned in following Jesus, Jesus rarely operates like that. Jesus rarely offers you an explanation for what he's up to. Instead, he just issues a command that he expects you to respond to. Sometimes it's come. Other times it's go. Sometimes it's run, sometimes it's stay, other times it's speak up, sometimes it's remain silent. I mean, it can be anything. But the point is that while we're often obsessed with looking for explanations, more often than not, God is waiting for us to follow a command. And that leads to the second thing you see in this exchange, and that's that doing the next right thing almost always requires a courageous step of faith. Rarely is the next right thing something easy. It certainly wasn't for Peter. I want you to look. Matthew kind of understates this next line in the story, but I want you to look at verse 29. It says, "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Every time I read that, I wonder if Peter hesitated, right? Matthew doesn't say that, but there's a part of me that thinks, if Peter was at all normal and the picture you get of him is that he had to come up to the edge of that boat, maybe look over and see the waves and feel that wind and that mist hitting his face and say to himself, I'm not sure this is what I was asking for. Like Jesus, I know I asked you to do this and then you did it, but this is not exactly what I had in mind. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about this a little further. And the reason I think Peter might have done that is because that's exactly what we do. You ever noticed how a lot of times we'll pray and we'll ask God to do something, to tell us something, to show us something, and then almost the second he does, what do? We start trying to negotiate with him. We start trying to explain to him why we actually can't do the thing that we were praying he would ask us to do. It's like there's this part of our DNA that we ask for something, and then as soon as it comes, we try to talk ourselves out of it just because that's what we do. But whether or not he hesitated, at some point, Peter mustered up the courage to step out of the safety and security of the boat and do something that by every conceivable standard was impossible to do. Make sure you understand, Peter had no more experience walking on water than you do. I mean, he didn't know any more about it. He had no idea how this was going to turn out. All he knew is that Jesus had told him to come, and so he went. And the question is, how is that possible? And it's only possible through faith. Hebrews 11:6 says it like this, "And without faith, it is impossible to please God." Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. My favorite writer is a guy named John Ortberg, explained it this way. He said, "It would be tough enough to try and walk on the water when the water is calm, the sun is bright, and the air is still. Imagine trying to do it when the waves are crashing, the wind is at gale force, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're terrified." Put yourself in Peter's place for a moment. Jesus is inviting you to go on the adventure of your life, but at the same time, you're scared to death. What would you choose, the water or the boat? The boat is safe, secure, and comfortable. On the other hand, the water is rough, the waves are high, the wind is strong, and if you get out of the boat, whatever your boat might happen to be, there's a good chance that you might sink. But if you don't get out of the boat, there's a guaranteed certainty that you'll never walk on water. This is an immutable law of nature. If you want to walk on the water, You first got to get out of the boat. So Peter does it, man. Against all odds, he steps out of that boat, and not because he was fearless and not because he had positive thinking and convinced himself that he could do anything. It wasn't that. It's that his courage was rooted in his faith. The great Dallas Willard said it like this: faith is an extension of knowledge based on knowledge. Let me say that again. Faith is an extension of knowledge based on knowledge. Another way to think about it is that faith is how I act based on what I know. Because I've already had experiences of God's power in other areas of my life, that should give me the courage I need to respond to His commands. But there's one more thing you see in this exchange, and it's really important because it may be the exact place where you are in this. Sometimes, when you're trying to do the next right thing, it feels more like failure than it does success. Here's what I mean by that. We live in a world right now that is completely obsessed with the idea of success. Some of you live with that kind of constant pressure. Every quarter has to be better than last quarter. The test scores this year have to be better than the test scores last year. Every record has to be broken. Every book has to be a bestseller. The crowd has to be bigger this week than it was last week. I mean, you know how it goes. And because we're so obsessed with that, because we're so taken with this idea of success, we run away from anything that feels like or looks like failure. But the truth is that God often uses what looks like failure on our end to move us to the place that He wants us to be. As you keep reading, Matthew 14, from one angle, it looks a lot like Peter failed. I mean, he had some momentary success, but it didn't last. Check this out, verse 28 again. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and he came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Now, Matthew does tell us Peter walked a few steps on the water, but eventually the same thing happened to him that happens to a lot of us. He got obsessed with what was happening around him, got distracted by all that, took his eyes off Jesus, put his eyes on his circumstances, and at that moment he started to sink. And you have to ask yourself, do you think you felt like a failure that moment? I mean, he made a good start, man, but it all unraveled so quickly. Just for a moment, try and put yourself in Peter's shoes. Here's this guy probably 18 months earlier, left his family, left all of his friends, walked away from a secure career in his family's fishing business. He cashed it all in. He followed Jesus around. He listened to everything Jesus had to say. He went everywhere Jesus wanted him to go. He did everything Jesus wanted him to do. And even in this moment, when Jesus showed up and asked him to do something that made no sense for him to do, he steps out of the boat and he tries to do it. And the result is that he nearly drowns and has to be rescued. And if that were the end of the story, you walk away and say, well, he tried, but he was a failure. Probably what Peter thought about himself. But that's not the end of the story. Look what happens next, verse 32. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. When they crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Make sure you catch this. If Peter's goal was to walk on water, then at best he had some temporary success followed by a tsunami of reality. But if Peter's goal was to help other people know Jesus, then what looked like failure was actually success. And all of that happened because even when he didn't understand what God was up to, he continued to do the next thing. followed by the next thing, followed by the next thing, until finally he wound up in the exact place where God wanted him to be. I got one last picture I want to show you. This is Elizabeth Elliot. On March 30th of this year, the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., opened an exhibit that's set to run through next fall that tells her life story. It's documented in a book she wrote titled Gates of Splendor. I won't tell you the whole story, but I just want to give you just a piece of it. As a college student at Wheaton College back in the late 1940s, she met another student named Jim Elliot, and after graduation, they both independently wound up living and working as missionaries in Ecuador. And while there, they kind of reconnected and kindled a romantic relationship until finally they were married in 1953. 2 years later, 1955, Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, along with 4 other missionary couples who had all moved there to be a part of this, felt a strong calling to try and reach a previously unreached people group, a group of Indians called the Auca Indians. As far as they knew, as far as they could tell, this particular group of Indians had had zero contact with the outside world. They never met anybody outside their tribe. After months of prayer and preparation, the day finally arrived when they would make their first face-to-face contact with the Auca Indians. But it didn't go as planned. On January 8th, 1956, 28-year-old Jim Elliot and 4 of his missionary partners were speared to death by members of the Auca Indian tribe. Think about this. For years, guys sacrificed, they suffered in hopes of reaching this tribe with the gospel, and the very first moment they had face-to-face contact, they're killed within moments of their initial contact. From every possible angle, it looked like a failed mission with a tragic outcome. If you know the rest of the story, though, then you know that rather than packing up and returning home with her now fatherless child, Elizabeth Elliot chose to stay in Ecuador nearly 4,000 miles from home. And over the next 3 years, she lived with members of the tribe who murdered her husband, started a church, and eventually won many of them to Christ. And so she became, if you go to Ecuador today, there's a section there where she's seen as the mother of Christianity in that part of the world. And so what initially looked like a dramatic failure was actually a long-term success. Years later, she was interviewed. She was asked how she found the strength as a 28, 29-year-old widow and now single mom to stay 4,000 miles from home and try to reach people and live with the people who had murdered her husband and most of her friends. And in answer to that question, she recited a really obscure poem from 1897 that she had learned as a child. Here's a few lines of that poem. Fear not tomorrow, child of the King. Trust them with Jesus and do the next thing. Do it immediately, do it with prayer, do it reliantly, casting all care. Do it with reverence, tracing his hand who placed it before thee with earnest command. Then as he beckons thee, do the next thing. Trust them with Jesus, do the next thing. Leave all the results and do the next thing. I want you to stand with me. What do you do when you're waiting for God to answer and you're not sure what you should do? You just do the next thing. And for some of you, it's really simple. You already know what that next thing is. For some of you, it's a private thing. Maybe it's a conversation you've been putting off that you need to have. Maybe it's a meeting that you need to start attending that you haven't been attending. For others, it may be a public decision. Maybe you're ready to repent of your sin, put your trust in Christ, be baptized into Him. Maybe it's something as simple as moving your membership and joining the family. I don't know what it is. My suspicion is you probably know. And so if you do, here's my encouragement to you. Whatever that is for you, just do it. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't try to negotiate something different. And most of the time, there's going to be no explanation. God's just going to tell you to do so. It's going to be come or go. It's going to be run or stay. It's going to be speak up or remain silent. I mean, it's never lengthy. It's never an explanation. It's just a command. And so if that comes, here's what I want you to do. Just do it. Don't worry about the next 3 things, the next 5 things. Don't worry about any of that. Just do whatever He tells you to do. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to sing a couple songs together. If you want to pray with somebody, if you have questions, if you need somebody to help talk you through some of this, or maybe you're ready to do whatever it is, the thing that God's calling you to do, maybe you're ready to be baptized or join the team, whatever it is, we want to invite you to do that. So David will be here, I'll be here, John's here. We'll be glad to do whatever. So if you need to talk to one of us, come meet us on this front row. Let's sing together.